Hello and welcome back to our discussion on XPDL macros. Previously we covered basic macros and today we are going to be covering advanced macros. So with advanced macros, the idea is what if we want to actually reuse parts of XPDL? So we don't care about capturing just the PDL expressions and reusing those in our macros, but actual pieces of XPDL like the result blocks. So suppose we have a rule that's sort of built. There's the query part that might have insertable arguments, and we could usually get away with just using a macro for that if we just want insertable arguments for the query itself. But what if we want the attributes we are returning to actually be insertable or variable? In this case, we have to use XPDL macros. So why would we want to do this? Well, maybe we have some sort of similar rule structure. So say we have this collision concept where we have one person colliding into another person. So all of the PDL that we have written for that is going to be very similar for all of these instances. We're just changing who's doing what. So if the claimant hits the insured, we could have PDL for that. And if we want insured hits the claimant, well, the only thing we're doing is kind of swapping the order of some of these words. So we can easily build a macro to take care of this. So now we have a rule that can find the claimant hitting the insured. All we have to do is call the macro, use these insertable name groups that we've probably found before in a parent rule, and then the results will just be those named groups. And then if we have a different rule for the insured doing this, we just flip the arguments here, and that's easy. What if we want someone hitting an object, like a tree, for example? Well, let's use a different name group here. Or if they're hitting a pedestrian, for example, just add the pedestrian name group. So this was minimal effort on our part. All we had to do was create 4 rules, and we're just swapping the sort of the name groups being used in the order of that PDL macro. So really, this is pretty good. This is a lot better than we had before. But we had to use this rule 4 times. So this, might not be what we wanted. This might be kind of too much on our screen, or all these 4 different rules. They're duplicating a lot of this work, right? There's result block, this calling this query. It's still kind of repetitive, and we can actually make this better by using XPDL macros. So the idea is just do something like this. We have one rule called collision. We look for the objects that we're interested in, so these named groups. Just make sure we have these in our text. And then we call an advanced XPDL macro called allCollision, and we just provide the named groups to be used there. And then we don't have to worry about a result block for each one of these things because that'll be handled within this advanced XPDL macro. So it condenses our XPDL code so that it doesn't take as much room, and we can kind of edit it all together. It makes it a little bit easier for us to manage. So how do we do this? Well, with the basic XPDL macros, if you remember from last video, the syntax is we declare a macro with macro colon, and then we provide a name, a list of arguments, and then equals a PDL query with one or all these arguments that we used. An advanced macro is very similar. We declare the macro, we give the name, parentheses, argument 1, argument 2, etc. And then we don't have an equal sign, but we open up a set of curly brackets. And then we define our XPDL queries. XPDL rules, actually, I should say. So, for example, say we have a rule like this, okay? We want a rule that says the insured hit something, okay? The insured collided with something, and that something is going to be a variable. So we have a macro for this already, a basic macro. So we're going to use this macro called collision. We'll fill in the first argument as just ensured, since that's what we know we're looking for. And then the second part, the second party, I'll leave it blank for now. We want to go on to return these results with a result block. So the match will be the entire query, the attribute colliding, the one doing the collision is the insured, and then our collided attribute will be variable. We don't know what to put in here yet. That's going to belong to our party 2. So far as this is just a regular XPDL rule, we're just leaving parts of it blank for right now. Alright, so how do I turn this into an XPDL macro? So what I want to do is just declare a macro, and I need to give it the name. I'll give it the name collision rule, and I need to give it an argument. And this argument will be party 2. That's just what I'm calling the argument here. I can call that whatever I want. So I've called it party 2, so now whenever I want to use that argument in the XPDL rule, I have to refer to it as if it were a named group. So where we have those blank spaces, I am now going to use $party 2, as if party 2 is some name group I have already looked at. So that's how we're going to reference our name groups within the XPDL macro. In the regular PDL macro, we didn't have to use the named group business. We just directly called party 2. But in XPDL, we need to refer to it as if it were a named group. And then I need to make sure I have these curly brackets surrounding everything. So I have my macro declared, I've named it, provided my arguments, opened up a set of curly brackets, and then within those curly brackets, I just define an XPDL rule that can refer to these arguments that I provided as if they were named groups. And that's what I have to do to create the XPDL macro, the advanced XPDL macro. So, how are we going to go about using this? Alright, so I'll have a new rule. I'll have a rule called inserting party 2. And then I need to have a query, which is a constraint of XPDL. So what we usually do is just look up the thing that we want to insert. And so I'll look up the word claimant. If you already have a name group, you can just directly call that name group. This step right here doesn't really take much processing, so you don't have to worry about it. And then to call the macro, I'll just say macro, function macro, provide the name. We had called it collision rule. And then you provide the actual argument that you want it to use. Now this is the tricky part. Look what I did there. I created a named group called claimant, and I'm using that named group with my macro. Now that might seem weird how I'm using it, because up until now, every time we wanted to refer to a named group, we had to use $named group. This is the one exception that you don't do that in. In a XPDL or an advanced XPDL macro, you don't want to use that $. That's going to give you a syntax error if you do that. So the reason's a bit technical, but just know that because you're referring to that named group as an argument, and then you're going to be using a $sign argument, that kind of $sign will kind of be duplicated if I had put a $sign there. So just for one instance, we aren't going to be using that $sign referring to that claimant named group. Leave that out. So if you're getting some syntax errors in your advanced XPDL macros, that's the first thing I would check, just to make sure you've got your name groups kind of without the $sign there. And of course you can go on to use multiple arguments if you'd like to do so. So here I have defined a macro called collision rule, and then I have party 1 and party 2 here. Alright, now I'll create a rule within this called collision. That's just going to be collide between party 1 and party 2 using that macro we've already defined. and then my result will be colliding party 1, collided party 2, name groups there, okay. So I've defined my macro. Now I'll actually use it. So at the bottom there, I have a actual XPDL rule that we run called inserting party 1 and party 2. Now my query here is going to look for insured in a claimant term here. And I will actually, I'll go ahead and use a dictionary for this because I want to be very accurate. So I have this insured term and claimant term dictionary. Okay, I've used those. Now I'll call them the insured and claimant named groups. All right, I'll give them named groups there. Okay. Now at the bottom, I call two rules. I'll use two different instances of this macro. The first one, so I'll call macro collision rule, and then I'll provide it insured, then claimant. And then in my next one, I'll do claimant, then insured. The order matters there. So it'll be insured, hit the claimant in the first one, and then claimant, hit the insured in the second one. So now both those ideas can be captured just in one rule. I just have two different calls of the macro there. And that's how you can use multiple arguments. Often, we want to hard code some values in our attributes. We don't want to return pieces of text. We actually want to return just some string information. So there's many different ways I can refer to the insured or the claimant party, right? The insured, I can say just the insured or the insured driver or our driver, or I can use abbreviations, inst or IV, insured vehicle, maybe. There's a lot of different ways I can refer to that person. Same thing with the second party. So I don't really want to return that explicit mention in the text as an attribute. Maybe I just want to return a hard-coded value like just insured, the string insured. So no matter how the author of the text referred to the insured party, it will be returned as an attribute, just that same value. It's consistent. That's a very common thing we like to do. So how can we actually do that with XPDL advanced macros? Because previously we've shown how we're returning $party1, and then there's an attribute, it was $party1. How do we customize that return to be something specific? Well, just use them as arguments. In this case, we're giving 4 arguments: party1, party2, p1, and p2. Party1 and party2, the name groups are just being used as they would regularly be in the query macro. And then instead of returning those as our attributes, we're returning these other things called p1 and p2. And then if I'd like to use these, so say I'll kind of hide that macro there, and I'll have a new real rule that's going to be run in XPDL called inserting arguments. I'm going to look for a bunch of things that I care about, like the insured, the claimant, animals, pedestrians, objects, etc. And then now I want to create a rule for all of these, or kind of a kind of XPDL run with a macro for all of these. So I'll do macro collision rule. I'll use the name groups without the $, insured, and claimant. Okay, those are party 1 and party 2. And then I'll provide P1 and P2. I'll just use capital I and capital C here just to differentiate them. These are just strings, basically. You're just going to type these words in. They're not going to be referring to any named groups. They're just regular strings. So those are going to be what are set as the attributes there. So I can do that for everything. So insured and animals, I just use the name groups insured and animals, and then the strings insured and animal. And that way, using these variable strings, I can just directly type in. I can hard set all of these attributes I'm returning without worrying about it. That's how we hard code values in XPDL. So, last takeaways, I think. XPDL is going to be very useful, or XPDL macro is going to be very useful for us for condensing very similar extractions to just have some swapping of these arguments here. So, insured hit claimant, claimant hit insured. Very similar extractions. You just flipping the order or the position of certain words. And so XPDL advanced macros can help you condense your code there. The only trick to them is remembering that when you're actually calling the macro, you don't use a $sign in that name group. With that, I'll wrap up our discussion on XPDL macros. The next time we talk, we'll be talking through an example of some advanced XPDL called entity unification. All right, I'll see you guys there.